Okay, let me share my screen. First of all, I should thank Constance, Sarah and Brian for inviting me to give this talk in the seminar. For me, especially being invited by Sarah and Brian is very special. For me, meeting Sarah and Brian was key to my PhD research, and their work is a great source of inspiration for the research and the theory that I will be presenting here today. First, I should say personally, academia is often a very tough and competitive world in which many interactions you have with people are informed by people's own self-interests. But interacting with Sarah and Brian is not like that. They have always been very gracious when sharing their ideas and comments, feedback, and critiques, and they truly enjoy the exchange of ideas, and I really appreciate that. There are two particular, more academic ways in which Sarah and Brian have informed the ideas that I will be presenting here. And this is my way to go from personal comments into theoretical arguments mostly. So I heard about Sarah first in 2016 when she published a very brilliant paper questioning the importance of Maurice Halbwachs for the field of memory studies as it is today. In the paper, she argues that Halbwachs' work was more relational and I would say also maybe more micro than it is interpreted today. And that for Halbwachs, memory as such was not very interesting, but that memory only becomes interesting if it is used to ask bigger sociological questions. And these insights are key to anything I will be presenting today. Then I met Brian in 2018 in the United States at a conference where I was presenting on Polish Holocaust memory from a Irving Goffman perspective. After my presentation, Brian approached me, politely saying that whatever I was doing didn't make much sense to him. Brian put me on a path then to explore interactional narrative studies in psychology, but also in interactional sociology and linguistics, and encouraged me to look at my data more from those perspectives. I did so, and I think I make a bit more sense to him today. Also, many of the so-called interscalar ideas that I will be presenting at the end of this talk are partly inspired by Brian's work with Holocaust survivor testaments. So these somehow personal introductions serve a theoretical goal in this context, because in this presentation, I hope to be doing two things. First, I will present the outlines of what I believe should be a social theory of cultural memory that borrows from three lines of thinking. First, from a cultural sociology that is sensitive to interactional dynamics, from narrative social linguistics, and from a literary theory that sees literary texts as situated moral interactions. Then, while addressing the potential shortcomings of this approach, I will introduce some future pathways for research. These concern memory and morality and memory in action. So throughout the talk, I will stick to theory and methodology because I believe in my published papers, they are hyper-empirical, and I would like to talk theory today. Okay. First, before I start explaining what is on this diagram, I should make a few disclaimers. So this diagram will guide me through the presentation. But first, the disclaimers. The theory I'll be presenting is not a theory of action or a theory of events. It is a theory of cultural memory. I use some ideas from action-oriented perspectives, interactional sociology, interactional narrative studies, reader response theory, to theorize cultural memory, not yet the other way around. The second disclaimer is that what I'm presenting here is a theory of cultural memory, not of collective memory. Over the course of the last few years, I have slowly moved away from Halbwachs' collective memory concept and crossed over to cultural memory. Cultural memory was coined and developed to desociologize collective memory. Cultural memories are relatively stable representations of the past Cultural memories are relatively stable representations of the past that reside in disembodied, objectified forms of culture. The Assmanns, Jan and Aleida Assmann, contrasted to communicative memories that are relevant for everyday meaning making and interaction. I personally see great value in turning cultural when studying memory. But in the book Constance just introduced to you, I argue that the communicative aspects of memory should be reintegrated in cultural memory. Cultural meanings and the structures of everyday interaction constantly inform each other. In this way, by reintegrating, I want to re-sociologize the concept of cultural memory and connect it much more to Durkheim's cultural thinking, especially the one from the elementary forms of religious life. I'll come back to this later in this talk. In doing so, I believe cultural memory should or could establish itself as a part of a social theory of culture. So far the disclaimers. Now I go to the diagram and have a start. I believe cultural memory study scholars study cultural meanings that stand apart from other cultural meanings in only one specific way. In their texts, narratives, codes, repertoires, discourses, these meanings explicitly refer to an event in the past. When theorizing such cultural meanings, I focus on two interlinked processes that are shown here on the graph. So what I have in mind is what I'm showing on this graph, a process of the culturalization of experience into cultural memory, a temporally focused process, and then a situation action oriented process which comes afterwards. Throughout the presentation, I will start on the left of the graph and then move over to the right of the graph. So first, a process conditioned by time, which meanings attributed to events move from the personal to the cultural realm. These are the so-called spirals of signification, to say it with Jeffrey Alexander, or processes of transubstantiation, to say it with Giuseppe Shortino, that make meaning to become cultural. This is the field of theorizing which Halbwachs, Jan, and Aleida Assmann were especially interested. In today's memory studies, not many scholars dare to take on the challenge to re-theorize the becoming of cultural memory. Most of us, and I should say myself including, look at what happens to stuff that is already cultural and then moves, is being reactualized, etc., which is happening on the right side of the graph that I introduced before. There are two recent scholarly exceptions that I should address here. I think Sarah's Mémoire vive, or Memory on My Doorstep, sits fully on the left of the graph that I showed here. It gives a great ethnographic and descriptive insight into how experiences become socially and culturally shared, institutionalized, etc. The book, Sarah's book, never makes such big theoretical claims, but nevertheless, I think it is extremely ambitious on that front. Secondly, there is the work of Hannah Teichler on the emergence of mnemonic metonyms that also sits on the left-hand side of this graph. She describes in properly cross-disciplinary fashion how memorial meanings become cultural, especially in her writing on the shell shock as a metonym, mnemonic metonym, I think is key here. So in my current writing and research, I think I can make one specific and very, very small contribution to the theory in this first time condition process of culturalization. Let's move to the next slide. Durkheim's elementary forms is still the starting point to theorize the becoming of culture. In the book, he argues that culture, religion among Australian Aboriginals for him, emerges in this way. At some point in time, people gather, and this focused gathering creates energy, which he calls collective effervescence, a very difficult word for, for non-native speakers, which is then ritualized, and rituals sustain the possibility to create this energy again in the future. What happens in these rituals is that the group creates symbols, signs, culture that represents the group and guide the ritual process. It's more complex than this, but this is enough for now. In Durkheim, this collective effervescence is very, very embodied. It emerges from physical gathering of bodies. When more contemporary theorists pick up this idea, they also stress the embodied nature of the becoming of culture. I think Randall Collins is a good example in his interaction ritual chains. Others have tried to make Durkheim a bit more disembodied. Jeffrey Alexander and Jan Assmann are key for me here. In cultural pragmatics, Alexander offers a macro theory of culture that is more sensitive to semantic and interpretative dimensions of culture. And I think the Assmann's great work is the insight that in literate societies, from the Egyptians onwards, culture also emerges through the institutionalization of texts. I believe that to understand the becoming of cultural memory today, there is also a more micro-discursive shift necessary that moves experience from personal to cultural. In a piece I'm currently writing with the title From Affect to Episteme, the becoming, discourse and the becoming of cultural memory, I argue that for personal experiences of events, testimonies or other autobiographical narrations that are invested in mostly in dealing with affects, especially when they concern traumatic events and difficult pasts. So for these narratives that are mostly invested in dealing with affect, to become cultural, they have to become discourses that are mostly discursively invested in establishing the epistemic authority of the narrator or the producer. Let me explain this a bit better. In social linguistics, from Harvey Sachs to Norek today, there is a quite marginal stream of research that is interested in the different functions of narratives of personal and vicarious experience in everyday sense making, positioning, identification, and evaluation. The key finding here from this stream of research when concerning narratives of difficult pasts is that narratives of personal experience narrated in the first person are generally most invested with making sense of affect, especially when they concern traumatic or difficult pasts, as I mentioned before. In these stories, telling rights, ownership of the story are usually taken for granted. We don't need to do interactional work through various forms of co-narration, for example, to establish those telling rights. Our personal experience are our own. That's it. And this is mostly taken for granted. Most of our audiences understand and accept that fact when we talk, with some exceptions. All of this changes when we start telling stories about the experiences of others. In that case, we are generally less personally and emotionally invested in the story, but we do more discursive effort to convince our audiences that we actually know what we are talking about. In a paper I recently published in Memory Studies, I analyzed all kinds of strategies to establish this as epistemic authority. For example, by adding "you know" at the end of your sentence, or "right" to ask for confirmation from your audience, or by aligning your narrative to supposedly to a narrative of a group. And I argue in that paper that stories of vicarious experience are at least as important as stories of personal experience in how we position ourselves to others. So what does this mean for us, this whole line of research? What does it mean for us as memory scholars? These scholars, Sachs and Norek especially, were or are not interested in seeing the implications of their research for scholars of cultural memory. I want to see what this research means for the theory of cultural memory. I argue that the culturalization of meanings also means narratively turning personal experience into vicarious experience. And there's a shift from investment in affect to one in establishing epistemic authority. But of course, nothing just directly jumps from personal to vicarious experience. There is a very curious intermediary stage in which people start culturalizing personal experience. Brian Schiff and Chaim Noy have a great paper in which they show, I believe, how a Holocaust witness culturalizes her own personal experience by blending her own personal story with stories she heard in the news. Schiff and Noy don't analyze it as such, but the discursive shifts from affect to episteme are happening there constantly when the person shifts from narrating personal to narrating vicarious experience. I would, in a future project, I would like to reanalyze the Schiff and Noy interview again with an eye to add a little to the theory of the becoming of cultural memory from that source, but also I'll be using other sources. So this was my short and small contribution to the temporally conditioned process on the left of my graph. Now I move to the situational aspect of cultural memory on the right-hand side of the graph. This part of the graph represents what people do, how people and when people do cultural memory in concrete situations. First, I should say that what makes this graph stand apart from similar graphs, not only this graph, but the conceptual model generally, stand apart from similar ones. For example, Alexander's cultural pragmatics, which you see here, and which actually looks very similarly as my own, which I only realized after drawing the graph, of course. So what makes my model stand apart from this one is that its inherent multiplicity and contradiction. This multiplicity in my graph is twofold. First, singular events don't generate singular cultural meanings and memories. The Holocaust, let's consider that an event just for the sake of it. We can discuss this forever, but let's just stick to considering that an event, has been culturalized in a multitude of opposite and complementary ways. That may seem obvious, but it isn't the case. Generally, people are socialized into not one, but multiple cultural memories of the same event, which mostly are contradictory or complementary in their meanings. So there's a great study by the Polish sociologist Marek Kucha, in which he shows that singular people are able to support both the narrow nationalistic and the universal cosmopolitan meaning of outfits, which are supposedly contradictory narratives. In my papers, he does it on the basis of survey data. In my papers, I describe how people can constantly shift between different and often very contradictory codes in their everyday interactions. I believe this finding, this multiplicity, has also some serious epistemological consequences for how we write about cultural memories and the people that do stuff with it. Analyzing a singular product, for example, one performance, one narrative, one discourse, or one text, literary text, for example, to theorize someone's cultural memory is not enough. If we recognize that people know more culture than they use in singular situations, then we need to triangulate structurally different situations in which the same person is producing stuff. I will come back to this idea of triangulation later on in this presentation. Secondly, so the second sense of multiplicity. Secondly, the interactional contexts in which people perform are also multiple, composed of various audiences and governed by different interactional norms and informed by different expectations from the audience. This is the case for both face-to-face, online, and literary interactions. People constantly move between various of these interactional contexts, which will impact how they do cultural memory. In my book, I argue that the work of Erving Goffman, but also George Herbert Mead, is key to understand this process. So then, these were my two senses of multiplicity, which I think make this model stand apart from others. Then what happens when people do cultural memory in situations is also twofold. People either pull down or pull up cultural meanings or cultural memories in interactions. I adopt pulling down as a metaphor, or pulling down culture as a metaphor from Rawls and Turovitz in a paper on Parsons. And they stipulate that culture not only refers to an autonomous set of meanings in texts or symbols, but is both symbolic meaning and constitutive practice, and this interaction. Rawls and Turovitz argue that durable symbols can be pulled down into interaction by participants in ways that give new significance to them. What and how people pull down culture in specific interactions will depend on how they interpret the expectations of their audiences and the norms governing the interaction. In non-literary interaction, in non-literature interaction, direct feedback from the audience can make them adjust their cultural performances or even make them switch to a completely new and different performance. I described this in the memory studies paper I talked about earlier. Pulling up, on the other hand, is my own small conceptual invention. What I mean by pulling up is when the microstructural nature of the interactional context might significantly change macrocultural contents and influences the form and content of macrocultural meanings. Macro theories are abundant to explain this sort of pulling up. For example, in these days, the extent to which COVID regulations change our interactional patterns and therefore cultural habits. But micro theories are lacking. In my book and in some of my published papers, I show how shifts in microstructures make possible shifts in dominant cultural meanings in certain contexts. So this was super theoretical. How do I operationalize this in research? To discuss my conceptual and methodological operationalizations, I need to take one step back in theory. I need to return to some developments that are specific to the field of memory studies. So the study of memory, cultural and collective, has now entered the so-called third phase, according to Astrid Earle. The work of the founding fathers of the field, Hal Boaks, but also Warburg, Benjamin, and Bartlett, forms phase one. While the work on national sites of memory following Pierre Neuvas's Lieux de Mémoire constitutes phase two. Phase three, which we are supposedly in today, is the breaking down of a lot of categories developed in phase one and two. In phase three, memory is literally on the move. Different concepts have been developed to analyze how memories travel through time from one place to another, from one community to another, and from one historical context to another. Memory has been called transcultural, transnational, post, multidirectional, globital, traveling, moving, prostatic, and so much more. These influential authors that coined these concepts in memory studies phase three have studied cultural and collective memory narratives and discourses from a diachronic perspective. Those memory narratives, a diachronic perspective, which you can see here on the horizontal axis of this graph. These memory narratives move to new and future presents, where they inform again how meaning is attributed to certain events. In all of these stages, indicated here on the horizontal axis, other people populate different social historical contexts in which these moving memories are studied. So, for example, Astrid Earle is working on a book in which she researches the Odyssey and how it's been passed on in cultural memory through time. Very diachronic perspective. This approach to studying memory is what I will name in the rest of this presentation the diachronic approach. The process of investigating collective memory diachronically happens on the horizontal temporal axis on this graph. This diagram, as I said before, this diachronic moving approach has been developed in response to memory studies in phase two, in which scholars have examined cultural or collective memories of a certain group in a specific point in time or in a specific location. This research was mostly influenced by Pierre Neuvas's work. So these phase two case studies focus on the precise point of intersection of the horizontal and vertical axis in the graph above, on the graph on this slide. In my book, I argue that there is also a third way to study memory, which can teach us at least as much about its functioning as the diachronic and the containment approach, which have been and I believe this third way has been largely underdeveloped. When taking into account this graph, I developed the whole vertical axis in my book. I take on a synchronic interactional approach and analyze how the same individuals attribute meaning to the past in different interactional contexts and situations in which they are embedded and operate. Instead of following the movement of memory narratives, discourses, and performances through time, I follow singular individuals and how they attribute meaning to the past in different interactions and situations in the extended present. So not time, but space understood as a social network of individual relations is key to this analysis. A synchronic approach follows the process as described on the vertical axis in this graph, and such a synchronic perspective allows me to demonstrate how complex, fluid, and contradictory people's reproductions of culturally dominant memory narratives can be. So how do I operationalize such an approach methodologically then? In my PhD fieldwork, I followed and observed a group of friends in different interactional contexts, either in online or in offline interactions. Online, I observed the same individuals in 2 Facebook groups, one private one of their friends and one public one in English with a lot of international people interested in Auschwitz. Offline, I observed the same group of people during their leisure time together for a whole long summer. Apart from the distinction between offline and online, I also distinguish between interactions that are either happening in the light social group or within the FIC community. FIC communities, to quote Jan Blommaert, are groups with strong social bonds between members. But members of the FIC community also interact with others outside of it. I have also observed members of my group of friends in some light social groups in which they are active. Light social groups are tied with temporary ephemeral forms of groupness or aggregations of people sharing just the rules of the encounter, but little beyond. So what you see here on this graph is the various interactional contexts in which I gathered ethnographic data during my fieldwork. In online light social groups or in online FIC communities, or in face-to-face light social groups, or face-to-face FIC communities, and face-to-face some mixed encounters. This was only ethnographic fieldwork. I should say that in these cases, my participants were always the same. So the individuals were always the same, and they were moving from interactional context to interactional context. Finally, after a year after my ethnographic research finished, I returned to the field and I interviewed some selected participants. I brought Facebook screenshots and field notes with me about the interactions in which they are involved and that I found puzzling. I asked them to reflect on their own actions and interactions and explain them to me. So by triangulating the data, in this way, I was able to map how my participants change their cultural meanings of the past, depending on the audiences they are encountering. The second part of my book then is all about that. I will not give more empirical examples here because I want to move on to a little bit more theory, but there are examples of these constantly changing shifts between narratives in the second, more empirical part of my book. Now I move on to critiques. There are 2 critiques on my PhD work and on my articles that I would like to single out here, and I would like to explain how I try to deal with them. The first critique that I would like to address here is very often voiced by Sarah, also during my PhD defense, and it relates to my initial graph. A focus on the micro-macro link. A focus on the micro-macro link and an approach that integrates interactional and cultural perspectives can obliterate meso-level factors and the extent to which they constitute and are constituted by memory, political, institutional dynamics. Questions about the state, institutions, party politics, and political power are completely absent from my framework. They should be included in at least 2 parts of the process, which I indicated here, in deciding which versions of narratives can become cultural, or at least shaping this process, and in deciding on socialization contexts in which people get to know cultural memory narratives and then perform them in social interactions. So the way I tried to deal with this critique was first, of course, ignoring it and then incorporating it. So in a new project, which also Constance already talked about a bit before, called Memory and Morality, I try to engage with these critiques by developing what Keighley, Pickering, and Bicht call an interscalar approach to memory. In the fieldwork that I'm currently doing, I'm doing ethnographic fieldwork in 3 Holocaust education projects, 1 in Belgium, 1 in Poland, and 1 on the EU level. I look at how people connect moral discourses about norms and values, and how they connect those to cultural narrations of the Holocaust in those memory education projects. My research consists of 3 long-term ethnographies with participants in such projects in Belgium, Poland, and on the EU level, as I said. The monograph that should result from this research, hopefully in a few years, will neatly describe how memory narratives resort in a macrocultural realm that I outlined before, versions of which are promoted on the meso level by institutions and actors involved in the politics of memory, and inform actions and interactions on the micro level, the structure of which then again impacts microcultural meanings. I believe that such a full circle approach to memory is missing in both theory as well as empirical memory research today. The second critique is the question where literature or literary text went in my model. And I think this is touching upon a fundamental problem of the field of memory studies today. In my book, I engage with and I argue against concepts developed by scholars in literature and cultural studies. However, these concepts aim to generalize beyond the fields in which they originate. Most of these scholars ask fundamentally sociological questions about culture, meaning, experience, agency, structure, and so forth. The micro perspectives I develop in the book are in dialogue with these concepts and ideas, but I work with different sources. I read everyday face-to-face interactions and online interactions by ordinary people. I don't read novels, or at least I don't read them as sources from where to theorize cultural or collective memory. The methodological triangulation that I discussed earlier, and which is again projected on the slide, doesn't really lend itself to literature. On the first-hand side, literary texts don't lend themselves to this form of triangulation for at least 4 different reasons. As opposed to face-to-face or social media interactions, these interactions are less immediate. Secondly, they involve higher degrees of interpretation, both on the part of the author, of the potential expectations of the audiences, as well as on the side of the reader. Thirdly, contrary to most everyday language and literary stories mostly don't claim to refer to the world outside the story or to the real people that produced the story. And finally, it would be methodologically very difficult to follow authors in different interactional contexts as suggested in this graph, just ethnographically, basically impossible. Taking into account all of these obstacles, the logical reflex for me would be to give up on literature as a source to study traveled memory or cultural memory in general. Elsewhere in the book, I even suggested for literature scholars to become ethnographers if they want to say something about what people do. Since the book was written 2-3 years ago, I'm slowly retreating from this very radical position, and I would now, despite its difficulties, vouch again for literature as a source of cultural memory here. What I want to do by returning, I want to bring in literature again by returning to a debate in literary criticism in the 1980s, in which literary texts were conceptualized as a set of situated actions. Literature was conceptualized there as a discursive space in which reader and author implicate each other. These implications can be informed by either macrocultural meanings, of which cultural memories are a specific kind, or what Wolfgang Iser calls the repertoire, and they're informed by micro-interactional norms, how stuff ought to be written and read, style, form, etc. The thing Iser calls things, he calls it strategies. The point of a second project of mine, with the working title Memory in Action, is to show that literature is also situated interaction, in which both authors and readers pull down culture in their interpretations, but that significant changes in interpretative structures and those interactional norms can also impact what constitutes culture and its cultural memory. Literary interaction is equally central to this empirical program as are face-to-face and social media interactions. So in Memory in Action, a book that I'm currently writing, I look at how cultural memory informs actions and interactions, and how the continuous or changing structure of interactions can change dominant cultural meanings. This situational, very pragmatic approach to literature, I believe, should allow cultural memory scholars to go beyond describing and explaining the circulation of texts and mobility, but provide empirical clues about what cultural memory actually means to people and what they do. So far, this overview, and I'm looking forward to some of your questions.
First of all, I would like to check if everyone hear me well. I hope it's the case. Okay. So I would like to thank Sarah and Constance, mostly because I know you, for this invitation, which allowed me to get to know the work of Thomas van der Poet. Those projects resonate a lot with my own scientific research. Your work, and now I address directly to you, if I may, presents a very original, fascinating, really, and particularly heuristic approach to analyze the functioning of memory processes in situation and to break with the metaphorical uses of the concept of memory. I will try to discuss your paper here today and also in regard to your book and the published articles I read. So in theoretical terms, you make several shifts, I would say. First, from the notion of collective memory, which is very commonly used, to that on cultural memory, which, and I quote you, is relatively stable and forms human communities, end of quote, and which allows you to bring the notions of cultural and communicative memories into dialogue and convergence. The second point, it's from the static approach of memory studies to a dynamic approach based on the analysis of interaction contexts in which individuals mobilize different narrative repertoire, which participates in the reactualization of contents and the pluralization of self. In other words, you place on the epistemological level, but also empirically, the individual and not the groups. And third, more generally, you propose a study of the reactualizations of contents linked to the past between individuals, then between the macro and micro level. And these shifts are part of a work in progress on social theory of cultural memory that is part more broadly, in my sense, in a very ambitious way, in the sociology of change, I would say, but maybe we will discuss it later. And anyway, I will ask you some questions about this point. In empirical and methodological terms, inspired by the symbolic interactionism approach, You propose a micro-sociology that aims to analyze the interactions in situation and the positioning of self in what they imply about positioning also of others. This approach allows you to analyze in your papers a very single interview or even a micro sequence of 3 minutes or 4 minutes of a dialogue between the interviewer and the respondent, which constitutes a real originality. In terms of methods, you rely on ethnography and semi-structured interviews, as you said. Inspired by the explicitation interview, you follow an innovative approach by having the respondents participate in the critical reflection of the results of your investigation. And it seems to me that there is not only an epistemological, but also an ethical and political issue at stake, which brings to mind Eric Chauviet's Anthropology of the Ordinary, Anthropologie de l'Ordinaire, and the political effects of desinterlocution in anthropology. This approach leads to have answers to following questions. Anyway, for me, and these questions I am asking myself in my research: how to make the respondents active in the elaboration of the survey, how to avoid betraying the surveys, a pitfall that many anthropologists mention in their work. After reading your text, I also intend to draw inspiration from this method of critical interviewing. And you give, I would say, you give a voice to your respondents and open a field of shared reflexivity, which also maybe contributes to a potential change of this position and potentially mobilized repertoire. This approach resonates with others' approaches in microhistory and also phenomenological sociology, even if I know very well that you don't inscribe yourself in this field, as evidenced, for example, by Nathanael Vedbled work based on ethnographic observation, interviews, and photo elicitation conducted during school visits of French students to Auschwitz. Like you, he insists, drawing more on semiotics and phenomenology, on the situated contexts that determine that is what is transmitted, and on what are the experiences semioticized from a lived experience. These approaches and the results of your work have led me to reflect on my current research on the transmission of the Jewish past in schools and out of schools settings, transmissions that take place between teachers and students, but also in the context of training courses on the history of Holocaust organized for teachers. Hence, a series of questions that I am formulating, trying to follow my own introduction and your presentation, which is not a very easy thing to do. It is undeniable, it is clear that the notion of collective memory is used today in various disciplines, and also in public debates, in media, in politics, and also in many mobilizations, social mobilizations, without it being clear what is precisely about. Marie-Claire Lavabre's analysis can provide maybe also a way out in this respect by proposing to situate a possible, it's a hypothesis, possible collective memory at the crossroads of scientific history, historical memory, which refers to public and political uses of the past, and finally social or common memories, those of particular groups. This way of looking at the things can also allow us to integrate the meso level of which Sarah speaks with Marie-Claire Lavabre, namely the levels of memories, and which Marilyn Crivello evokes with her scales of memory, another approach of this meso level. You say that, I quote, "too not many dare to challenge to re-theorize the becoming of cultural memory." And most of us look at what happens to stuff when it's already cultural. End of quote. And I have to admit, I do it too. I think everyone do it, especially at the beginning. And my observations in classrooms, in school visits to massacre sites, in training courses for Polish teachers allows me to record a certain variety of discursive registers and narrative contents mobilized according to the interactions. But they also argue in favor of the durability and low variability of the dominant narratives. It is as in the field of possibilities, le champ des possibles, I don't know how to translate it properly in English, the field of possibilities, yes, but of these variations was precisely correlated to the public uses of the past. What I mean that the public uses of the past seems to have very strong weight on this social appropriations. So that's the question for you. Can you give us some examples of how micro situations participate in modifying macro cultural meanings? In other words, can you give us some examples of pulling up concretely? As your paper was very theoretical one, so now can you give us an example? And this is, I think, the strength of your work, as it is precisely in the, I would say, somehow sociology of change. In other words, this hypothesis seems to me to have real consequences. It opens the new possibilities, notably in terms of education and the transmission of knowledge, around the inclusion of new terms of dominant in the dominant narratives, the modification of dominant narratives. So if it's possible to change the macro level from the micro level perspective, it opens also this champ des possibles, this field of possibilities, to maybe change this dominant narratives, which many researchers show that it's very stable at the time, for example, at school, but not only. The second point leads me to some social, the social characteristics of your respondents you work with. How did you integrate them into your analysis? And how do these social characteristics play into the interactions? Several particularly interesting works deal with this aspect. I think I am thinking now of Bernard Lahir's research, particularly in the plural actor, a work that deals with the activation and the setting aside of social dispositions according to the context of interactions. I think also about Alexandra Oeser, who in her study, when we will talk about Hitler, and she shows very well that the context of interaction plays, of course, a role. For example, not every situation allows for jokes about Hitler, but she also notes the weight of socializations and social characteristics that shed light on these mobilizations of the self in the situated context. And my own work allows me to distinguish also between curricula as a normative device and their constructions as a public use of the past, real curricula, those that are really taught which are not normative paper, and the hidden curricula, the last two depending on the social properties of students and teachers, as well on the moments of interaction. Furthermore, beyond the characteristics on and the social dispositions, do you think that the material contexts, such as the landscape, for example, can provide keys to understanding the modes of circulation of memory in inter-individual interactions? Still on the subject of the transmission of knowledge and learning, have you been able to observe how individuals in concrete situation not only communicate differently according to the projections they have of interaction situations, but how these interactions participate in the dissemination of and reappropriation of knowledge? What's the part of knowledge in these interactions? Yeah. And connecting to this, can you say also some more about your new fields of research? And if I may, as you mentioned, the work of Marek Kucia, and also to refer to your some empirical data, I will return here to some details about the mobilization of categories you work, which I read for this session with very great interest. In both your articles and in your book, you attribute two meanings to the two types of narratives used by your responders. A nationalist one, quote now I will quote your text: Catholic Poles and Germans occupy the main role of the narrative. Jews and other victims are generally absent from the story. And the liberal one, I quote, these narratives are more open to acknowledging the victim status of non-Catholic Poles and tend to discuss the agency and of the actors during the Second World War and Holocaust as running less along simple ethnic lines. They also prioritize the Jewish past, passed off, and Jewish culture in pre-war Poland in their narrations of the Polish past. End of quote. By the way, I didn't note it on my notes, but I'm very happy to hear. But this is the comment. I mean, for the English-speaking and French-speaking public, it's not so surprising, but I'm very, very happy to see not Catholic Poles and not only Poles, because in Poland it's very often Poles and Jews. And I think it's very important to signify that Poles are also some, I mean, Jews could also be Poles, but this is only now my comment to my comment. So considering these two narratives, can we not consider that these two narratives are in fact part of the same narrative widely deployed by the current rightist government and the previous ones? And they are not in opposition, in fact. The existence of multicultural Poland is precisely the guarantee of the supposed lack of anti-Semitism in Poland. And this narrative device is widely used by in the speeches of presidency, ministries, and educational projects for schools and teachers and so on. And similarly, the distinction between the toponymy of Oświęcim and Auschwitz is quite recent, I would say. I mean, recent. It's the quality, that's adjective, but it's anyway, it's quite recent, and it's supported also by the current nationalist government, as it is fully in line with current historical policies. And I was very surprised to notice that all students I interviewed and all teachers I interviewed use only the term of Oświęcim. and only guides in Auschwitz use the term of Auschwitz. And also it's the same thing for other camps in Poland. And these few remarks led me to the way in which you have taken into account the scientific literature produced by historians, sociologists, and political scientists in Polish language. This literature is in fact rather little quoted. I have the impression in your book and your papers. And I agree fully that these are often long-term analyses of the public use of the past in Poland, the use of the Holocaust and Auschwitz, of Polish nationalism, of historical policies, of anti-Semitism representations, and so on. But they are, and of course, they are based on a few, if any, case studies. This is true also. Nevertheless, this literature, which is very rich, makes it possible, I think, to better contextualize the statements made by the respondents, following the examples of the English language works that you are using for the same subjects. And I suppose that some elements of these texts could feed the categorization of type of narratives deployed in interactional frameworks. And also, and I think it's also resonates with your question about literature as a social source. I can't help but think on the reportage Oświęcim Czarna Zima, Oświęcim Black Winter by Marcin Kacki, made among the inhabitants of Oświęcim, which is not, of course, the scientific literature, but the reportage. But I think it shows also how individuals and groups appropriate or reappropriate here literary, even if the reportage is some kind of mezzo level between research maybe and journalism and literature. Anyway, appropriate the memory of Auschwitz and Oświęcim. And finally, the last central question, perhaps the most important one, anyway, it's important for me because it opens up precisely it helps us to understand eventually how to modify some dominant narratives. So how experiences become socially and culturally shared, institutionalized. In other words, I would say that how are some narratives institutionalized and not other ones? And the history of non-Jews Poles' participation in anti-Semitic pogroms before, during, and after the Second World War is an example. Despite the establishment of the new school of Holocaust historiography, gathered around the researchers of the EP span, legitimized on the international level, fully legitimized on the international level, and despite a series of symbolic gestures, including that of President Kwaśniewski asking forgiveness to the Jewish people in the name of Polish nation, this history struggles to gain legitimacy. It obviously clashes with conservative, right-wing, and even nationalist, and of course nationalist circles, but also in a different way with liberal circles. So some question to you, could this sociology maybe of controversies shed light on this subject? And does such analysis require to take into account not only a level of structure of the interaction, but also the social structure and its modifications? And in this respect, Andrzej Leder, in his work that has become famous in Poland, offers very interesting analysis of the rejection of the theories about anti-Semitism in Polish society. He speaks of a modification of the social structure imposed by the invaders. The first one, it was imposed by the Nazis because Jews were killed in Poland. So this social structure was changed by this fact. And the second social change was imposed by the communists with the agrarian reform. As it was imposed by the invaders, and therefore they cannot be assimilated, appropriated as its own by the society. And Roger Bastide, in a canonical article in French, on the survival of African reeds among Amérindians, also insists on the importance of the social structure in the modifications of cultural collective memory. He speaks about collective memory, so that's why it's last but not least, it only remains for me to salute this fascinating work and hope that this dialogue can continue beyond this session. Thank you.
Should I reply? I want to just pick out a few points that I thought were very interesting. First of all, thank you for all the comments, and I would like to have the list of references. First, I want to say something about sociology of change. I'm in memory studies for exactly the opposite reason, because I'm interested in continuity and the long-lasting meanings that inform our interactions in the present and the stability of them. And I was going to quote somebody, but I don't know who said it, that Durkheim was a cultural theorist, a theorist of cultural change. And the whole, what Halbwachs added to this was a cultural theory of continuity. And for me, creating these interactional disruptions is just a methodological way to uncover the normal, the ordinary. So disrupting the interaction is a way to understand the non-disrupted, everyday, ordinary thing. So I see those repositionings in that perspective. That's also one of my fascinations with the new work that Sarah is doing on slow memory, to see how continuity and change and sociologies of continuity and change fit in there, both Durkheim and Halbwachs. Then a few smaller points. Pulling up is very hard to empirically grasp. I can give you an example, which is not memory related, and there are no colleagues of mine or no participants in the group, so I can talk about it. So I'm trying to do a little natural experiment in Trento. I live in Trento, it's in Italy. In Italy, the cultural norm, also in my social circles, is we don't drink cappuccino after lunch. So cappuccinos are only drunk. For me, I consider this to be a macrocultural. Cappuccinos are only drunk in the morning. And in my various social circles, I try to disrupt this norm, and I employed a few strategies and see the extent to which they work in certain interactional contexts. And in some social groups, my postdoc colleagues that I go for lunch with, and afterwards, people were very resistant of my disruption, and I know some of them, not everybody is accepting, and almost the majority is drinking cappuccino after lunch. So there we went from micro to meso. So the dominant, let's say, meaning of cappuccino on the meso level changed because of some norm disruption on the very micro level by something you could call a trendsetter.
Yeah,
yes, but then to go from meso to make group level meanings come together to generate cultural change. I don't know how it would work empirically. I mean, I can do some community organizing and see if Italians will start drinking cappuccino after in a few years, and if the meaning of cappuccino changes long term. I don't know.
Okay.
On the other hand, in the disruptions in my papers about the interview, the interview analyzing the two papers that you mentioned, in which I also twist the micronormativity of the interaction. I asked a very unexpected critical question of this participant, who is not at all expected, which completely changes let's say, normativity in this micro interaction, and therefore also what is dominant in the overall interaction, what is ought to be said throughout the rest of the interview. So there is also some little pulling up there, but I agree it's difficult to go directly from micro to macro, and especially between group level dominant meanings, and then the more macro cultural realm. I lack some understanding. I'm sorry to have an example that is not memory related, but I think is nevertheless cultural. One thing on material and landscapes. So I didn't talk at all about my fieldwork, but my fieldwork for the PhD was based in Oświęcim, which is a Polish town of 40,000 inhabitants, in many ways an ordinary town, just for the fact, well, not just for the fact, but for the fact that there is the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum there, and that the most iconic site of the Holocaust is on the territory of this site. Of course, the museum as a site, but also as an institution, is very powerful in determining what the sacred memorial realms are in the town and how people ought to behave in those. Well, many of the inhabitants have different ideas about sacred and profane in their own town and challenge these sacred, very material realms. Either profanize sacred realms that are already sacralized by the museum, or sacralize profane realms in the town that are not considered at all by the museum. So the struggles over sacred and profane in the town between museum and inhabitants are over a very specific material sites. This concerning, yes, so not concerning social characteristics of participants, and that I put in the comment a critique on over focus on interactional context, of course. Yes, I am aware of the fact that not everything is contingent on interactional norms. And especially in the new work, I'm focusing a lot on how we are limited in a way by culture. Not anything is possible. Like there are only a few narratives about the Holocaust that we are possibly being able to tell in certain interactions. And my participants themselves, I chose this group because they didn't have university education. They were mostly manual workers. Nevertheless, they had an interest in the past of their town. And they had their catalog of memory narratives was quite expensive. So I try to focus on this group of people, which I think is underanalyzed in the Polish context, especially. One last thing about the concept of memory and trying to deal with its metaphorical nature and try to set it apart from other concepts. I think if we want to keep this concept valuable for research, we have to do a lot of effort to conceptually make it stand apart from concepts that are very close to it: knowledge, narrative, meaning, culture, interpretation. So Brian is writing a lot about it, and I think if we really want to keep the field going and make theoretical innovations in sociology and in cultural studies, it's there. It's in making clear what exactly makes memory stand apart from these other things. And for me, as I said, cultural memories are just cultural meanings, but standing apart in only one specific way, is that they have an explicit reference to the past. So I don't buy into this this discourse, which is also quite popular in the field, that culture is memory and memory is culture. There are some distinctions in explicit reference. Just summary.